Okay, we've heard already this gentleman has come all the way from New Zealand to speak to us. So please give a big round of applause to Chris Carswell. When did you get in, Chris?
Yesterday morning.
Are you all right? Do you need to sit down? You're okay standing. Thank you, Chris.
Thank you. Okay, welcome everyone. So what I want to be talking about today is primarily what Liz was going to cover. So we're going to be talking about GPP3 and also some recent trends in publication planning. So my name is Chris Carswell. I'm the editor-in-chief of Pharmacoeconomics and also The Patient. And I also manage a team of journal editors that deal with a lot of industry papers. So I have quite a lot of insight into some of the issues that these papers bring. So when I'm going to be talking about GPP3, I was one of the authors of GPP3, and I led the authorship section and also the section on payment to authors, which I know has caused a lot of discussion and a lot of controversy. And in fact, I don't think there is true consensus amongst GPP3 on that topic, so I'll talk about that. And then I'm going to talk about some issues in publication planning that I think are top of the mind and give you the editor's perspective on those issues. So issues such as the predatory journals, open access, social media. And then I'm going to finish with 3 issues that I think keep editors awake at night. One is an issue that I think is an increasing trend from the industry, that they want faster processing of papers and an easier process through peer review. I'll talk a little bit about that. Talk about some checklists, and then finish talking about the conflict between transparency and authors wanting to protect their intellectual property, which is quite an issue in health economics and outcomes research. So I'll talk about that as well. So as has already been mentioned, I got the call to come and substitute for Liz last week. I was enjoying with the family a holiday out on the Pacific in New Zealand. That was a long way away from anywhere. So I've been traveling since Friday morning. So forgive me if I appear a little jaded. I'll try not to appear too bad. So many of the slides, I want to thank Terry Penner from BMS for helping me put together some slides in just a very short period of time, particularly around GPP3, and also colleagues in Insight who helped put some of these slides together. So I'm going to talk about GPP3 and particularly some of the key issues or the key new content in GPP3. I'm going to talk about conflicts of interest, I said about authorship, and a couple of other issues, and give you my perspective on that. So we're going to start with a little question and get you used to the keypads. So you've all got keypads in front of you there. You just need to press the number corresponding to your answer on the next slide. So how many have you read GPP3? Have you read it from front to back very diligently? Have you just quickly skimmed it? Or do you actually not know what GPP is? So vote now. Okay, that's quite interesting. So over half have quickly skimmed this, and 8% don't know what GPP is at all. So, and 38% of you have read it from front to back. Okay. So for those 8%, what is good publication practice? Well, it's very much focused on papers that have been sponsored by a commercial company of some sort, whether it's a pharmaceutical company, whether it's diagnostics or biotech. And you'll see these following words, this talk about accurate, complete, and transparent throughout GPP. So it's really aiming to ensure that the research reported by those commercial organizations are complete, balanced, timely, accurate. And it applies to journal articles and also scientific congresses. But many of the issues in GPP3 also apply quite the same also to academic papers as well. So there's some really good points there that the authors of other papers can also take away from GPP3. It's very timely. I think we're all aware of the increased scrutiny, the big transparent world that we live in now. I think you're all aware of some of these issues. And in fact, when I was travelling down to on my holiday last week, Ben Goldacre was on New Zealand radio, and he's about to embark on a theatre tour of Australia and New Zealand, talking about many of these issues. So it's very front of mind of the general public. But it was quite good, or it was heartening to hear that he was trying to definitely emphasize that it's not just an industry problem, that the issue in terms of not publishing clinical trials is equally an issue for the academic community as it is for the pharmaceutical industry. So he was reasonably balanced in that respect. And I've got to say, something that was really heartening for me as part of GPP3 was the real commitment, and I'm not just saying this because I'm in a room full of industry people, but the real commitment of those people on that steering committee to make sure that they did everything right and they did everything in an ethical and transparent way. I think, of course, the challenge is to make sure that is disseminated across the whole of the industry. And I certainly see some real howlers in my work. And I'll touch on that a little bit later. So this is the evolution of GPP. Hopefully we're mostly aware of this. The first started in 2003 in CMRO, and then in September last year, the GPP3 was published in the Annals of Internal Medicine. And some of the new elements are particularly focused on data sharing, the expanded evidence base about the benefit of medical writers, which we just touched on there. There's some discussion of that in GPP3. The authorship section was considerably revised, and as I said, I led that group, so I'm going to talk about that in more detail. And there was obviously the section on authorship payment and a section on conflict of interest, or what we call now disclosures. Big global participation. We had people from all areas, all stakeholders, a large reviewer panel, 94 people, and we had over 2,000 comments. So that was a lot of work to actually go through, and a good geographical representation as well. If I'd had more time, we could have had a little competition about here about how many people can name the faces, but anybody tell me who's missing from that? Who's represented by the smiley face? You can cheat and look at the bottom and try and work it out, but yeah, Jane Moore. So why is GPP3 important? It helps us develop publications ethically, but I think that the second point there is key, that it actually demonstrates to the public that we're serious about publishing papers accurately, completely, in a transparent manner, and ethically. And that last point, which I touched on earlier on, that it equally applies to research sponsored by academia and government as it does to the pharmaceutical. There's many good points to take away from GPP3. So what's new? Well, there's some guidance on the ICMJE updated authorship criteria, and I know that's caused quite a lot of discussion amongst people. We have developed some common issues regarding authorship, and I'll touch on those, and put them into a nice table at the end, which hopefully you can quickly reference. We have provided some guidance and I'm not actually entirely sure that we've improved the clarity on that. We have changed the guidance a little bit, but it'll be interesting to see what you feel about that, about author payment and reimbursement. We've given additional clarity on what we think is guest and ghost authorship, talked more about the benefit of medical writers, touched on data sharing, but that's obviously a very rapidly changing world, and also did a little bit of improvement in terms of formatting. 10 key principles of GPP3. And on this slide, I'm just going to talk about the first 4. The remainder I'll talk in a little bit more detail. So we say the first principle there, all clinical trials should be reported. Again, these words, completely, accurately, balanced, transparent, and timely. Reporting and publication processes should follow applicable laws and guidelines. Important to follow journal or congress requirements to avoid duplicate publication in particular, so avoiding presenting the same abstract twice at different meetings if not warranted. Talking about the issue, I think, that we sometimes see as editors where primary data is published in more than one paper. We also talk about publication planning and development being a very collaborative approach involving a number of range of skills. And I'm going to touch on the others, which are very much focused on authorship in the next slides. So authorship issues. So these are the principles relating to authorship. So the first one, we talk about the rights, roles, requirements, and responsibilities of all contributors should be confirmed in writing before the start of the research, and preferably and in all cases before the publication begins. The importance of authors have access to all the relevant data. I think number 7 is very important as well. The author should take responsibility for the way the research findings are presented and be willing to take public responsibility for all aspects of the work. So they should have confidence in the integrity of everybody on that publication. You know, in the past, I think we've had some issues. Certainly editors have approached authors when a reader has raised an issue, and sometimes the author has said, well, I didn't deal with that section, so I can't help you. And I think that's why the ICMG guidelines have been revised to say, well, it is up to you. You know, that you have a responsibility to, if you didn't deal with that section, to actually sort of contact the relevant author on that publication to help us resolve the issue. I also like number 8, that author lists and contributor statements should accurately reflect all substantial intellectual contributions. Whenever I get a paper submitted, I'm always asked for a statement about what each author did. Sometimes I get a regurgitation of the ICMG guidelines, which isn't awfully helpful. Just saying that all authors contributed to the following 4 criteria. What I really want is much more detailed account of who did what. And I think that really helps in this sort of transparent world. And we touch on conflicts of interest as well. So the guidance on authorship in GPP3, you can see the ICMG criteria there about talking about substantial contributions to the concept and design of the work, acquisition, analysis, and interpretation of the work. Important to draft it for critically important intellectual content, and final approval of the version. And then the GPP3, how we help to elucidate that. So we're talking about, we define what we mean by a substantial contribution, and it's not necessarily just funding, acquisition of funding, or acquisition or enrolling patients in a clinical trial. It needs to be more than that, generally speaking. We provide clarity on what it means to critically revise a paper, and it isn't just for grammar and language and formatting, it's more than that. And for you to be able to approve the final version of the paper, you need to read it, from front to back. And then finally, the issue I just touched on about the fact that it's important to be accountable for all aspects of the work, and have integrity, have confidence in the integrity of the author's contributions. So you must meet all of those 4 criteria. We give some guidance on guest and ghost authorship. So we talk about the issue, particularly around company and company-sponsored employers and contractors. Quite often, when I give talks to the pharmaceutical industry, particularly health economics and outcomes research departments, they ask whether, or they're concerned that if their name goes on the paper, that it will colour the author and editor's view as to whether to send a paper to review. And really, from my perspective, it doesn't at all. What I want to have confidence is that everybody that's listed as an author meets the criteria, and that there are no ghost authors or guest authorship on the paper. So it doesn't colour my view if there's an industry author on a paper or not. So we also make the statement about authorship must not be used as a reward or gift for services rendered. I'm afraid that's still a lot more prevalent in the academic environment, that still it's pretty common, I think, for heads of department to be on papers even though they really didn't meet the authorship criteria. I think it's a lot different here in the industry. So this curly question about authorship payment. So in GPP2, it was never pay authors. In GPP3, well, sometimes you can actually pay authors. So what did we say about clarification on this issue? Clearly, you can't pay people purely to lend their name to a paper. I think we all absolutely adhere to that. You should never pay people if their research is already part of their job. But you can actually pay people for reasonable reimbursement of expenses. So whether that's travel-related, statistical analysis, medical editing, and writing. And it's also, we said in GPP3, appropriate to pay, for example, a health economics and outcomes research consultant who happened to actually do the analysis, to pay them to actually write that paper up as well. It was felt, and there was a lot of heated discussion, but it was felt that it's just akin to employing a medical writer to write it up. Why shouldn't a self-employed consultant be paid to actually do that writing? I personally believe, in terms of an economic analysis, that the paper benefits considerably from a medical writer actually writing it up, because they, I think, have the skill to communicate, whereas quite often somebody that does the analysis is so wrapped up in the analysis that they don't actually present that or communicate that information clearly. But it'll be very interesting to hear your views. I know that different companies have different policies on this issue. So we did put in the final bullet point there that it's difficult to prove specific intent, so people may choose to prohibit compensation for time spent authoring a publication or presentation. So what are the most common authorship issues that we provide guidance on? One, the number of authors. How many is too many? We did actually come up with a number. There probably wasn't an awful lot of scientific evidence behind the number. We came up with a number that 10 was about the maximum amount to go onto a paper. Yeah, I think that was just pulled out of thin air a little bit. But I have seen plenty of papers as an editor where I've looked at it and thought, how can there be so many authors on this paper? So there is sometimes an issue. We talk about author sequence, how you determine author sequence. Addition or removal of authors. It's not uncommon for us as editors to get requests for this when a paper is going through the review system. Quite often this issue arises when a paper's been through peer review and there's some real comments that really need some considerable work, some additional analysis. And in that case, I think it is reasonable to actually add an author if it's appropriate. But believe it or not, we still get requests for addition and removal of authors at proof stage. So even at that stage, we get people trying to change the authorship of papers. Talk a little bit about the death. What happens if an author dies or changes affiliation? I touched on this issue around company and sponsor-employed authors, and professional writers as authors as well. And if you've read GPP, there is a table at the back which nicely summarizes these issues. So what and when to publish? I think we've probably all had issues where you've submitted a paper to a journal and you get the standard reply back saying, we thank you for your submission, but it isn't of high enough interest for the journal. I'm sure many of us have had those the replies from journal editors. So we're talking about, ideally all trials should be published in peer-reviewed journals, regardless of the interest level. But but we do recognize there are papers that are difficult to publish. However, I think, and I'm going to touch on this in a little bit about the rise of open access journals. I think in most cases it is possible to actually get papers published. It just might not be in the journal that you want to get them published in. So the statement was, that we readily accept that you can't necessarily get papers published in the journal of your choice, and there are certain types of papers that are difficult to publish, and that you may well get multiple submissions or rejections from appropriate journals. So we do make the statement that it is possible to post on the registry if you end up not being able to publish a particular study. And the same issue here with terminated studies as well. In terms of the conflicts of interest section, we've renamed it disclosures because we felt that conflicts of interest may well, in some cultures, have different connotations. In terms of it might imply wrongdoing or corruption, so we talk a little bit about that and talk about a timeline of 36 months as being relevant for declaring certain conflicts of interest. So we've now developed, or ISMAP have developed a web page which is really useful. I don't know how many. Raise your hands if you've looked at this. Anybody looked at this page? Yeah, a few people. Yeah. And we've got John, who has been involved pivotal in organising this website. So a subcommittee was established, and we developed some training materials. And you can, if there are any issues or things you don't understand about GPP3, you can actually submit a question. And believe me, it does go through a very rigorous process, and there's a lot of strong opinions in terms of developing the reply to that question. So these are the committee members that are involved in actually helping with that GPP3 website. Okay, so I just want to talk about some issues that are particularly top of mind, I think, in publication planning at the moment, and give you the editor's perspective on that. So I want to talk about initially a little bit about open access. We know that hopefully that there are two major types of open access, and there's green open access, where the final author version is generally submitted to a particular repository, and there's gold open access, which is a publisher's version made available, usually subject to a charge. A huge rise in open access journals. It's new journals popping up all the time, and also an increased number of articles being published. So I think the choice is becoming more and more difficult in terms of how choosing an appropriate journal. There are over 10,000 open access journals listed in the directory of open access journals as of October 2015. So one can have fully open access, you can have a hybrid open access, which is the journals that I edit, and you can have obviously delayed open access journals as well, where some journals make papers open access after a period of time. Clearly, there's a great advantage with open access. I think it's been a great move that papers become freely available to the general public. And if you look at the article downloads of the journals that I edit, the first top 10, even the top 20, they're dominated by papers that are open access. I think the problem, of course, is that trying to determine whether that open access, what quality of those downloads are. If somebody pays what is quite an expensive amount to pay for view from a subscription journal, you can be fairly sure that they're very interested in that paper, and they're going to read it and possibly use it to help improve their clinical practice. The problem is that you don't necessarily know the quality of the downloads going. And this is my dog. So, and then of course the issue of the predatory journals. And believe it or not, this paper did actually get accepted by a predatory journal. International Journal of Advanced Computer Technology Online. These authors were sick of being spammed constantly. I'm sure many of you in this room have had similar emails asking you to submit your latest research to X, Y, and Z journals. And these authors just got so sick of it that they submitted this paper to the International Journal of Advanced Computer Technology Online. And it got accepted with minor changes. So there's obviously clearly an issue with predatory journals. So what is a predatory journal? Predatory journals exploit the gold access model for their own profit. I think it does pollute the pool of science. I think it's getting harder for people, for clinicians, for example, to be able to discern what's good and what's bad. I think that's good for the reputable journals, because I think people will eventually gravitate to the journal as a sort of a stamp of credibility. So if your paper gets published in a good quality journal, that will help. And then there's this issue, I think, that the issue with predatory journals, and that they're offering this sort of cheap, easy, fast access to getting a paper published. I think that's disseminating to other journals as well, and I want to touch on that a little bit later. Back in 2012, I think Jeffrey Beall was fairly unknown. I think most people in this room now will probably know Beall's list. Really helpful list to be able to help you choose what's a good journal and what's a bad journal. There's also the directory of open access journals as well, which really helps, I think, make sure that you are publishing to a reasonable journal. Some help or guidance on how to spot a predatory journal. So use of the words European, American, or international should make you somewhat suspicious, because quite often authors get more scholarly credit for publishing in journals with those sort of terms in the title. The journal is not based in the place which it claims. So a European Journal of Pharmaceutical and Medical Research based in India, for example. Be somewhat suspicious of that. A fake impact factor. Some of these fake impact factors which can be purchased for a monetary amount. Look out for an unusual number of decimal places as well. Poor spelling and grammar. It's also an issue. Lack of digital preservation. Often published research disappears from predatory journals and the research will be lost forever. So that's another issue to look out for. Lack of a digital object identifier, can disappear at any time. The ISN differs to that stated on the website. Lack of typesetting, just a journal looking very haphazard. So as I said, many predatory journals use spam email to solicit submissions, so be very careful. And there's an example of the decimal places with the impact factor 1.3064. So a little touch about metrics. I mentioned about it's hard to discern whether downloads from open access journals are genuine, downloads, in fact, that people read it and actually use that information to help with their practice. I think metrics do help us a little bit in that. As an editor, it always gives me heart if I publish a paper and people tweet about it or blog about it, then I think they've clearly read the paper and they're clearly interested in the content of that paper. So I think that can help us, and I think the sort of the merging of merging of open access and social media together can actually have a real impact in terms of papers published in journals. And I've experienced that in my journal. I recently published a couple of papers on the UK Cancer Drug Fund, which is a very controversial issue in the UK. Some people believe it's just a way of circumventing the rigorous approach of NICE. Others believe it's onco-favoritism. Why don't we have a heart drug failure drug fund? Why don't we have a COPD drug fund? So it's a very controversial topic. And a couple of editorial board members who are active on social media published it in Pharmacoeconomics and started tweeting about it. The papers were open access and had a real impact amongst people. So metrics and open access can have an influence on the dissemination of papers. So historically, impact has been measured on a journal level by the impact factor. I think it still is very prevalent, but there are other ways now of looking at article level metrics that help. But consistency does vary. Downloads can mean different things depending on the publisher. Could mean downloading the full text. It might mean PDF. It might mean HTML views, different durations. So do the research on that if you're interested in those sort of metrics. Here's an example of the Springer website at the bottom there. Lots of different metrics you can see from the different journals. It gives you average time from first to first decision through to different types of usage to different types of impact of papers. And a lot of publishers now use social media and promotion, and Springer and ADIS are not are one of the ones that do that. The recent randomized trial of social media from Circulation, they concluded that the jury's out as to whether open access and social media improve citations and downloads. I think it's still open for discussion. But there are some social media successes, and these are just some of the examples which you can have a look at on the Springer website. Definitely online article sharing is increasing. This graph shows that the percentage of articles in Thomson ISI that get social media shares, and it's going up and up and up year on year on year. But I think some of that sharing is just sort of fairly robotic. It doesn't really add a lot of value in some cases. So just before I finish, one of the issues I think that we need to do better with is the use of additional content, and I can't understand why we don't use this more. So by this I'm talking about submitting videos, podcasts, different types of supplementary material that can actually help communicate, rather than just a written paper, communicate the research in a small amount of time to a different type of audience. Being the editor of a journal called The Patient, which is very much focused on patient reported outcomes, that type of material really lends itself, I think, to the use of digital media. So I would encourage you to try and develop some of this sort of stuff to try and communicate the research. So this is a slide that Liz developed about what keeps journal editors awake at night. So, and I think many of those issues were definitely true a few years ago. But I think as we've got clever and clever with different computer software, etc., I think many of these issues we can actually spot now at an early stage. So duplicate publications, redundant publications, misleading reporting. And although we see it time and time again in the news now about many of these issues, I don't think those issues are increasing. I think it's just we've got clever at detecting them. But I think there are three key issues for me that keeps us still awake at night. And the first issue that I want to touch on, and I'd really like to get perhaps your feedback on this, is this what I feel is a move from the industry, that they want more and more for papers to be published quicker and quicker and quicker, at possibly sometimes the expense of robust peer review. And that causes, I think, some sort of conflict, certainly in terms of the editor colleagues that I deal with, in that they feel pressure to commit to certain specific timelines. But then, the fundamental value I think editors can bring is robust peer review, getting really good comments and improving the paper. And I feel those two issues together, it does cause some degree of stress. For me, I think if you add an extra couple of weeks to peer review time, so say something takes 8 weeks and instead of 6 weeks, or 8 weeks, or 10 weeks instead of 8 weeks, but you actually get robust comments, I think that's well worth it. I appreciate that there's always a need to get papers out in the public domain in a timely fashion. I know there are some horror stories about papers taking 6 months and longer. But I think when we're talking about a matter of 6 weeks or 8 weeks, I think it's better to actually wait and get some really, really good comments. The second issue I wanted to just briefly touch on are reporting guidelines. And I think that's germane because we're talking about GPP3. But I think we can publish as many guidelines as we like, and the Equator Network is really good. But if we don't walk the talk, if we don't actually put those guidelines into practice, then really what is the point? And I often see papers submitted and they say we followed the PRISMA guidelines, or we followed these sort of guidelines, and they've ticked all the boxes and given you the page number of where they've done that. But when you actually, as an editor, go to that page, you find that actually that information isn't there, or they've just blindly ticked the boxes. And actually, recently I've seen systematic reviews now where in the title it says PRISMA compliant systematic review of drug A versus drug X. And it's sort of, I think, trying to use PRISMA as some sort of marketing of the paper. Particularly, it seems to be coming from Asia. So I think we really do need to walk the talk in terms of, we can publish as many guidelines as we like, GPP3, but if we don't walk the talk, then what is the point? And then the final issue I want to leave with you is this issue of intellectual property and transparency, which is particularly, I think, an issue in health economics and outcomes research. And this is where an author may submit a modeling study, or they might submit a patient-reported outcome survey. And as an editor, you ask for, say, a technical appendix with all the details, all the nuts and bolts, or you ask for a copy of the survey, and the authors come back and say, I'm sorry, that's intellectual property. We can't actually give you that information. And this is an example of a letter I got back to me just last week, talking when it was an economic evaluation of a drug. It was an industry-funded study where we'd asked for additional information, a technical appendix, and they said that because of time commitments and other pressing commitments, they couldn't supply the technical documentation in a timely manner. The model software contains information of a commercial and proprietary nature, and confidentiality considerations prevent us from being able to distribute it in the context of a peer-reviewed publication. Therefore, we have decided to redirect the submission to a clinical journal. To me, that really quite dismays me that's the case, because they're really trying to circumvent really good peer review by trying to publish it without necessary oversight. So I don't know how we're going to overcome that. In the other journal that I deal with the patient, I often get authors not willing to share the full text of the survey to us because they feel as though people might use that survey without paying the necessary usage or license fee. So it's certainly an issue that is something that's of concern to me. So I hope I haven't appeared to be too jaded. I'm happy to answer any questions.
I'll come and facilitate.